Song of Mornius, Chapter 38. Screaming, Avalar whirled, cowering as the fierce tide of giants surged toward her, around her, pounding down the tunnel behind her. In rags and filth she huddled over her sword, her torn hands streaming blood over its pummel of black-woven steel. Dripping tangled roots hung by her head, covered with fuzzy gray mold. On the walls the insects crawled slowly. She heard the clacking of their mandibles, the scuttle of others burrowing through the stone. Light was blinding upon her head. Raising her hands, she glimpsed through her fingers an impossibly bright and beautiful circle of cloudy sky, tasted clean air made crisp by the scent of falling snow. "Mother," groaned a little boy's voice. Children pressed against her back, a boy and a girl, her own, ripped from her at birth and only now recovered. She had battled for them, torn her fingers, wrists, and palms, ripping their captors apart with her hands. Now they huddled terrified behind her, bruised and cut by the stampede of escaping giants, eyes wide as they gaped, trembling into the darkness where the others had fled. "Gavorian, wait!" Avalar shrieked down the empty tunnel. "Great leader, wait! Do not leave me!" Her voice echoed back, emphasizing her abandonment. Gavorian wouldn't come back. This was their only chance. Driven by the commands of the Black Sword to keep its strength, her leader had no choice but to obey. She hunkered down, embracing her children with her one arm, as with her hand she gripped the sword. The sky above was a trick, a delusion of freedom like so many others. She had heard of this cruel game of the slavers. Somewhere close she knew they were laughing, watching her through their staffs, no doubt, from some vantage point she couldn't see. "The sword feels real," she thought, glancing down at its bright metal. The feel of it in her hand seemed familiar, yet she had never wielded a weapon before. With care she lifted its tip into the light, stared at the water sliding down the lovingly tended steel. "Mother, let us go," said the voice of her son at her back. His urgent hands gripped at her arm. "Come, Mother, we need to catch up." She shook her head. "No," she whispered, "something is wrong." Then she saw the hand on her arm, saw gray bones only squeezing her wrist. Turning, she stared at the two small skeletons huddled beside her. Their eyes, made luminous by the brightness above, shed tears down cheeks of pitted bone. She screamed and staggered back, slapping bones away that crumbled into little piles. "What is my name?" she screamed at them hoarsely. "Who am I now?" "Avalar," said a stern, quiet voice. She whirled. It was a human voice. Without hesitation she charged blindly into the light, flew by him and slammed against the tunnel's unyielding stone. Again she whirled. A human stepped from the brightness, unlike any she had seen before. Instead of robes, he wore armor on his breasts and thighs, fur down his shoulders and back. Glittery mail across arms he stretched wide, showing her that he had no weapon, carried no staff or sword. Crouching low, she snarled her fury, her fingers clenching long furrows in the mud beside her feet. "This time I shall not miss," she spat, raising her sword. "Avalar Mistivir," he said slowly. With measured steps he approached. "That is your name, giant, Avalar Mistivir. Your father is Grevelin Mistivir. You were a friend to my brother Cameron Florn." She backed at his approach, dropping all at once the weapon she had never used. It too was a delusion, magic toying with her mind. She retreated to huddle against the wall, gaping at him in terror. "My name is—" He nodded. "You see? Deep down you do know yourself," he said quietly. "You dropped your sword for a reason, Avalar, so you wouldn't hurt me. Giants in your time never attack or hurt the defenseless. Avalar, you found the mines for us. Good girl. But now Galen needs your help." Avalar shook her head, her hands raised to fend him off. Yet she watched him. Confidently he spoke, his strangely familiar voice calming to her heart. I need your help, Giant. You couldn't save Cameron, but you tried, remember? That means something to me. You, he stressed the word, mean something to me. Avalar, now you're helping me like you couldn't help Cameron, and I need your help. Tears filled her eyes as she stared at his face. They slew my children, she moaned softly. My children! He stood before her. With unflinching fingers, he reached up and stroked her arm. Avalar, you don't have any children. He cleared his throat. Somebody else lost her children. Perhaps that somebody else is haunting you now. But this is your life, not hers. The Black Sword spoke to you, remember? Not to Grevelin or Pony. You live on Hathra with your father Grevelin. You sailed here to fight for freedom for your people. She swallowed. Shifting on her heels, she stared down the tunnel. Cameron? She whispered. Tears blurred her sight. That's right. The human, tugging at her hand, urged her down to her knees in the clammy mud. Closing her eyes, she felt hands on her face, human hands free of magic. Leader Tarek? Trembling hard, Avalar opened her eyes and stared at him. Yes, Leader Tarek, and I would never hurt you, nor have I given permission for you to leave me just yet. He smiled and glanced at her hands. You're bleeding, too. We'll get Captain Bjorgen to fix that. Tarek paused and glanced up at the worried faces staring down at them. She's all right for now, he called. Bjorgen and Galen, get down here. Roth, you and the rest gather what supplies we can use for travel underground. We leave the rest here. Kildoran has assured me the Shan will return to the place they were foaled. Trembling, Avalar stood. I can help, she breathed softly. She moved to the opening above her head, reaching with her arms into the light to catch Galen's legs as Bjorgen swung him down. Carefully she set her small friend on his feet, and then reached up again for the prisoner. Galen stayed her arm. Wait. Tarek Florin, Holram, gripping her fast with a strength she was coming to identify as Holram's own, turned Galen toward her leader. You need to know, said Holram softly. Your suspicions are correct. Melian is joined to Filrina Vlyn. He linked with her to savor her pain during her ordeal. She never died, so that link never ended. I believe he must know of our location through his link with her. He will continue to know so long as she lives. Avalar stared upward at the prisoner as Bjorgen waited to help her down. Does she know? Tarek asked softly. Holram shook his head. This kind of link she could have no awareness of. When I healed her, I discerned the essence of my foe. At the time, I thought it mere echoes from her past. Now, during this attack on us, you notice she never once roused, not even after you started traveling. By keeping her asleep, Melian kept an open window to track your movements. Tarek nodded grimly. I did think it quite the coincidence. Looking over, he met Avalar's stare. You can bring her down now, Giant. Bjorgen, too. Avalar turned again to the glimpse of open sky above her head, listening hard to the two men behind her. You must slay her at once, Tarek Florin. Holram's soft voice, heavy with sorrow, reached her across the tunnel. It is the only way to shut that window. After the mercy I've already promised, that would be a cruelty, Tarek said. Nevertheless, Avalar caught at Filrina's swinging legs and then reached to grasp her hips. Setting the woman gently on her feet, Avalar reached again for Bjorgen. She turned once the older man was safely down, studying the tunnel for the first time with eyes free of delusion. The crawling insects were gone, the tunnel frozen, not wet. Even the mud she had gouged under her feet was to her sight now, frozen and hard. She looked at her hands, at her torn bloody nails, and grimaced. Heavy sacks dropped from above, landing with dusty thumps on the tunnel's floor. Then she was reaching again to help the rest of the humans, Lieutenant Roth and the 2 guards. "As it turns out," said Tarek slowly in a voice that carried. He met Horum's steady gaze from behind Galen's eyes. "We've been traveling in the wrong direction all this time. This isn't the right mountain." "It's not?" Roth turned to stare at Tarek. Avalar stood with her teeth gritted, her eyes on her leader's face. His gaze was intense, boring into her own. She shook her head, something he wanted from her. Then she looked at their prisoner. "Florina Vlyn," Avalar said softly, "come here." The woman turned toward her, raising her arms, expecting to be tied. From behind her, Tarek lunged. With one fluid motion, he seized her head with both hands. There was a sharp snap of bone as he brutally twisted with his arms. Without a word, Florina fell limply to the floor. "Tarek!" Björgen stumbled in shock, staring dumbfounded at his commander. Roth stared open-mouthed at the twitching, crumpled form. Tarek, stepping back, saw his expression and nodded. "Happy now?" he asked bitterly. "She's paid the price, hasn't she? Sorry if there wasn't enough blood or terror for you." "I can't believe you just did that," said Björgen, his voice brittle, hard. "Neither can I," Tarek said, "but it had to be done." Roth, swallowing hard, continued to stare. At their feet, Florina's chest heaved with agonal breathing. Her body, reaved of life, was shutting down. Slowly, Tarek knelt by the woman's body. With a gentle hand, he pulled strands of hair from her face. "Never seen someone killed outright before, have you?" Tarek, angry now, was looking at Roth, driving his point home. "Not quite how you imagined? One moment she's warm and alive, breathing and feeling, thinking, maybe harboring hopes for herself, and then—" Tarek snapped his fingers. Sinking to his knees, Roth turned to the wall and quietly retched. Avalar reeled sideways. Numbly she bent to retrieve the largest of the packs. Around her the guards and Björgen did the same, Björgen with his overbright eyes. Then Tarek stood. Reaching out, he caught Galen's arm. "Horum," he said, deliberately stressing the name. "You still with me?" Avalar, trembling in the pit of her stomach, watched Galen nod as if half asleep, and turned to shuffle toward the woman on the rocky floor. He knelt to press a soft hand to her head. Then he closed his eyes. "Is he gone?" Tarek asked softly. "Gone," said Horum, without looking up. "Shall I now?" he asked. "Yes, do it," said Tarek. Horum lowered Galen's head. From across the tunnel, Avalar saw Mornius flash. Then Florina was coughing hard under his hand, crying out and thrashing in delayed animalistic instinct to flee danger. Horum soothed her with a touch. He climbed to his feet, drawing her up gently with his hands, supporting her with his arms. Florina stumbled in a daze where she stood, her frantic eyes darting to meet Avalar's, then Tarek's, then back to the warder. Tarek cleared his throat in the shocked silence. "Florina Vlyn," he said sternly, "your little fainting spell has delayed us considerably. What have you to say for yourself?" As Florina turned toward his voice, Avalar watched Lord Argus bobbing languidly toward them from the tunnel's deep darkness, his face blurred to hide his mood. Florina rubbed at her forehead. "Fainted?" "Indeed you did. Did I not say it's important to keep up your strength?" Tarek nodded at Roth to follow after Argus. The young man, his complexion still pale, hurried into the tunnel after the ghost's green light. "You didn't wake up during the battle either, and that could have got you killed," Tarek was saying. "From now on you eat what you're given, and no more purging it up after." "Yes," he added at her look, "Avalar really does tell me everything." Florina nodded, staring at her feet. "Can you walk?" Björgen asked her quietly from where he still crouched by the packs. Avalar shot a questioning glance to Galen standing beside her. He was Galen again, she realized. The sense of heat was gone. The fierce burning Horum's magic fed his bones. "Everyone walks." Tarek moved to the packs and hefted one to his shoulders. "And everyone carries something." "I can't believe you did that." Avalar heard Virgin whisper, looking up from his sorting of their supplies. Tarek, I'll explain later, Captain. Taking a breath, Tarek turned toward Filrina. Can you walk? He gestured Galen ahead, then motioned to Avalar to take up the rear. Filrina met his scrutiny and nodded slowly. Trembling, she stared down the tunnel, her eyes wide with fear. Almost Avalar could read her thoughts. Beyond that tunnel lay the place she had been tortured and very nearly killed. Come. Stepping forward, Tarek gripped her arm. Avalar moved behind the rest, the tangled roots making her crawl. The air was musty with the scent of saturated wood and wet soil. In her dreams, this part of the tunnel had been clear, threads of gildstone lacing the walls, but water dripping endlessly from above had eroded the rock, had brought with it dirt, fungi, and a smelly substance that squished between her fingers. She wrinkled her nose, keeping her head up, her gaze on the whipping flames of Tarek's torch. Far ahead she could hear Roth's machete, heard the rhythmic strikes as he worked to clear the way. It's so dark, Galen whispered from in front of Tarek's torch. It reminds me of the cellar they used to. Don't think about it, said Tarek. Eyes on my torch, Galen. Argus is up there with Roth, Galen observed. He stopped in the tunnel, waiting for Tarek's light to touch him. Roth isn't using a torch. Do you think he sees the ghost shine? I thought only you and I could see Argus, and creatures of magic like Avalar. Avalar focused beyond the three humans. She spotted Argus standing tall and bright before Roth, Virgin, and the guards, disdainfully ignoring the roots that jutted through his transparent form. Tarek glanced down at his shoulder as Filrina coughed softly. Galen, he said, Roth has the right idea. These torches are burning our air, and yes, Roth and the others can see him. Argus is helping us. He's making himself be seen, but he's too far ahead. From what I know of warders, Tarek continued, they can gather, over time, power enough to make suns. Raise your staff, Galen Laval. I was hoping to conserve my strength, Tarek. Avalar, stopping behind Tarek, lowered herself as far from the smoke curling under the ceiling as she could. Galen Laval, she called, I find this lack of air troublesome to my health. Will you not help us? It could get worse, Filrina warned. Many of the tunnels have cave-ins. If this is one, you'll have to dig your way through. And if you do, the air you find beyond will be stale, like breathing poison. That settles it, said Tarek. What good air we have needs to be preserved. He lowered his torch. Without further discussion, he ground out its fire against the wall. Smoke choked the darkness. Come on, Tarek said. Avalar heard him move forward, feeling his way through the tangle of roots. Then he stopped. Galen, you need to keep moving. That's it. Catch up to Roth. Tarek, I can't see. Avalar moved behind the humans. Accustomed to darkness, she wriggled between the roots. At certain times during a cycle, daylight was brief on Hath Rahon. Whole afternoons would pass when the sun's disk barely cleared the sea, and before that... She ground her teeth. For 200 cycles her people had been forced to live beneath the ground, in tunnels even blacker and fouler than this one. Ow! Galen yelled as he fell. Then he clambered to his feet. After a pause, the skystone flared, a vivid blue in its cage of curled talons. Avalar, turning, studied the dirt at her feet, the lines of gemline green mushrooms reflecting the light. As the humans continued forward, she bent, plucking the little caps from their stems as she moved, and slipped them inside her parka's furry pocket. Galen slowed as he reached Virgin's back. Ahead of the captain, Roth stood with the guards and Argus. The four men turned as Avalar drew near. She frowned at their expressions, their sudden concern as they peered up at her. Something? Shaking Filrina from his arm, Tarek wedged himself between his men. He stopped short, looking down. Avalar nodded as she watched his body stiffen. You have found a giant, she breathed into the silence. One of my people. She reached forward to grasp his shoulder, to pull him back and around to face her. His face was white, his hazel eyes troubled. "A child," he said. "Bad enough they enslaved your people, but your children, too?" She sighed. The slavers called them sniffers on account of how our little ones could sniff out guildstone. All giants sense magic, Leader Tarek, but not so well as our children do. With our offspring taken young and trained, forced to be eyes and ears for the slavers, our captors found secrets of power within Malion's mountain, the blazing stone Malion lost when he first came here, and the rare black stones their priests use, stones from the core of this mountain that naturally absorb all magic. Worry deepened the lines around Tarek's eyes as he looked up. "Avalar, Giant, are you all right? Maybe the time has come for you to call Pony. I don't want you—" "No." Avalar gritted her teeth. "The time has not come. The world began on the shoulders of giants. Mayhap it will end for the failure of mine. Still I must try, Leader Tarek." Nightbringer roused in me something in my heart. I remembered what giants are supposed to be. She drew a deep breath and sighed. "I will not falter again, nor will I turn from this path I have chosen." Tarek chewed his lip, and Avalar saw his focus turning inward. "I have no idea what's ahead. Giant, what if I can't protect you? What if you die? What will happen to the world?" "I am not here to be protected." Discreetly, Avalar jerked her chin at Galen and lowered her voice. "If he fails, my life or death will mean naught." Tarek and Filrina at his side both turned to follow her stare. Galen crouched among the men, the light of his staff glowing softly. The other stepped back, fearful of what the warder in his flesh might do at the sight of the dead child. As they did, Avalar saw the reason for their concerns, their worry for her. The child's skeleton lay in pieces, the fragile bones of the face and skull punctured and torn away. "Graken," Avalar said. "The slavers always brought two at least with them into the tunnels." She swallowed against the dryness of her throat. Before her the child stood in silver shimmer, his eyes luminous as he met her broken gaze. "When the sniffers failed," she whispered, "they were quickly dispatched. They had no meat for the Graken, only the children who failed them." Avalar rubbed at her eyes, shuddering as the child's death played itself out before her. With the speed of a blink, the Graken pulled him down. He died without a sound, his bones and cartilage parting below his head, his swift dark blood spreading to puddle warm and glistening around her feet. "Avalar?" Tarek tugged at her wrist, and the vision fell to pieces. She strained to focus on his face through her tears, forced herself to see the child as the mere pile of bones he really was. Her hand clenched at her sword hilt. Violence trembled in her muscles as she stared past Tarek's shoulder into the darkness waiting beyond Argus's green light. Almost she could hear the groaning of the slaves, see the rhythmic sparks of metal striking stone. Now again the slavers existed. They were real, still living in these tunnels, still hunting down and killing innocents. She glanced at the woman Tarek supported with his arm, a woman who had been like a slaver that he seemed to forgive. Except that she knew better. For this there could be no forgiveness. Not really. Avalar stiffened as she focused on Argus, on the terrible grief screaming from his dark phantom eyes. She stepped away from the others, from the warder who summoned power through the staff to quietly cremate the child's small bones. "You hear them," she whispered to the Thalian knight. "You hear your ghosts, just as I hear my memories." He shook his head. "I am them," he countered. Crossing his arms, he hugged himself with limbs he could no longer feel. Unable to find comfort in the gesture, he dropped his arms. "You see the past," Argus told her. "You experience echoes from long ago, but the giants themselves, their spirits, rest in peace, Avalar." Argus flinched then from something she couldn't see. He nodded at the empty air above his head. "The ghosts I see still cling to their lives. They scream for her blood. With a look of utter disgust, he jerked his head toward Filrina. Yet he protects her. Argus groaned through his teeth. Always he stands and speaks to his brother, whispers in his ear. He loves her still, even after all she's done. He keeps away her ghosts, too, all her angry victims. Turning, Avalar stared at Tarek. Who does? She asked in confusion, glancing at Galen. Who keeps them away? Argus held up his hand, forestalling the rising tide of words from her heart. Cameron Florn, he said simply. Who else? Cameron? Fresh tears sprang to her eyes. Frantic to see her friend, she looked around her at the tunnel, at the twisted roots endlessly dripping, the scattered mushrooms thriving beneath them. Is he here? Her voice cracked in her throat, quivered as her neck muscles tightened. Does he know how hard I fought? How hard I tried to save him? How much I... Hush, Giant. Argus's luminous eyes softened. Empathy pulsed from him, his sketch of an image flickering bright. For a moment his pain was gone from his face, replaced by concern for her. He knows, Argus whispered only to her. Of course he knows. Argus paused for a moment, his gaze locked with hers. His eyes glinted sharply, as if he saw in her something that moved him to tears. Never doubt it, Giant, said Argus softly. He knows.